Tom Harlan had poured most of his years into holding his spread together, mending splintered rails, swapping steeds, and grinding through dry spells and mounting bills that stretched on without mercy. So, when a wandering card sharp sauntered into the tavern and laid out a dare, Tom couldn't turn away. The whole settlement crowded close to witness it. The sharper boasted he held something finer than any plot of earth or drove of stock, and he goaded Tom with the lure of riches just within reach. Tom, aching to shore up his land and worn thin from seasons of money woes, consented to a tense round of poker that left half the room breathless. When the last card fell, Tom triumphed. The sharper grinned in a manner that set Tom's teeth on edge. But victory was victory, and the place burst into clamor. Tom figured on cash, perhaps nuggets, perhaps prime mounts, but not at all what lingered out back of the tavern. Two hard-eyed fellows hauled out a young Apache maiden, her hands tied with cord, her gaze unyielding. The weariness from bondage etched her features. The sharper slapped Tom's back and declared this maiden the treasure he'd staked. The onlookers whispered, some chuckling, some uneasy, others merely intrigued. Tom's gut churned with revulsion. This wasn't what he'd bargained for. He objected at once, but the sharper merely lifted his shoulders, claiming the bargain sealed, and that Apache-kin fetched prices on the shadow trade. Shame burned through Tom as the snare he'd stumbled into dawned on him. Yet abandoning her to the sharper and his crew seemed a deeper wrong, particularly when he caught the way her frame stiffened, bracing for fresh hurt. So he sliced the bindings, hoisted her lightly onto his saddle, and resolved to grant her shelter, at least, until he puzzled out how to guide her back to her kin. Her name, she murmured, was Lyra. She said little at the outset, giving curt replies or wary looks, tracking his steps like a fawn, uncertain if the tracker had set down his rifle for good. Upon arriving at the spread, Tom held back, affording her room, sharing meals and letting her rest in the extra shack he'd raised for hands. He couldn't fathom her trials, but he noted the quiver in her fingers as she took her bites and how she always kept her face to the entry. His chest tightened with an ache he couldn't pin down. He hadn't sought this gift, and he wanted no share in the savagery. She had borne too much. He only yearned to mend the harm inflicted on her. In the days that followed, Lyra started to study Tom amid his labors. She never meddled, but she watched keenly, sometimes lingering on the veranda as he readied horses, sometimes trailing him softly as he inspected feed bins. Once, when a colt bolted free and almost crushed Tom underfoot, she darted in with startling swiftness, seizing the beast's bridle and soothing it with a murmur in her own speech. That marked the first glimpse of her easing, her eyes holding a fleeting glow, before she drew away once more. Tom offered thanks, and she dipped her head wordlessly, but the subtle ease in her stance whispered that faith was taking root, slow as dawn. A week after he'd led her to the spread, peril showed up. 3 riders pulled in, kin to the band that had first seized her. Their chief, a mark-jawed thug called Vance, asserted Lyra was pilfered goods and ordered Tom to yield her. Tom planted his feet, denying the demand. Vance cautioned that meddling in their dealings spelled battle. The riders departed, vowing reprisal, and Tom sensed the rope cinching around his throat. He wasn't merely shielding an Apache maiden now. He was crossing into the trail of souls who traded in flesh for coin. That evening, Lyra drew near him for the first time, without dread shadowing her stare. She recounted Vance's outrages against her folk, how they stormed villages and hawked prisoners to bandits and bent officials. She made clear that going back meant her end. Tom vowed he held no thought of surrendering her. Something in his tone must have swayed her, for she edged nearer, laying her palm to his breast for an instant, a mark of thanks, of resolve, perhaps of deeper ties. Then she pulled back, slipping to her quarters, leaving Tom rooted there with a burden in his soul he couldn't name. He knew the threat lingered, heavy as storm clouds. Guarding her courted a clash he doubted his strength for, but turning aside ran counter to his grain. He hadn't claimed riches in that poker hand. He'd shouldered a duty, and perhaps a shot at atonement, one he hadn't known he craved. And already dark shapes loomed past the spread's bounds. Tom scarce closed his eyes that night, turning the clash over in his thoughts, measuring the toll of the path he'd chosen. The spread, teetering as it was, couldn't weather a feud with ruthless sorts. Still, each time he mulled packing Lyra off for her own good, her gaze returned to him. That silent appeal, the steel veiled within, the way she had begun to breathe anew. Freed from the brutes who had ravaged her band, she had no safe passage without braving wild lands, and he couldn't thrust her into the realm that had bartered her like chattel. So he shored up what he might, testing firearms, bolting the stable gates firmer, readying the grounds the lone way a solitary herder good. Come morning, Lyra didn't withdraw. Rather, she fell in step with him at his tasks, bearing a faded pouch stuffed with leaves and simple implements she had foraged from the soil. She said she aimed to lend a hand, and wordlessly beyond that, she set to mending frail fence gaps with methods Tom had never known. Her fingers flew sure, her motions exact, and for the first time Tom grasped the breadth of her wisdom. She wasn't a load to bear. She was an endurer, a fighter's child, forged by ways ancient as the hills cradling his claim. As hours wore on, they traded quiet words, and Tom felt pulled to the steady fire she bore. Lyra, for her part, regarded him with fresh candor, as if she'd settled he was one to lean on. True strife rolled in as the sun sank amid haze rising from the bluff, 6 horsemen nearing, Vance and his pack loaded for bear. Tom bade Lyra bar the shack door, but she held fast, emerging to his side, head lifted, her bearing unshaken. Vance swung down with a vicious smirk, jeering Tom for wagering his breath on mere wares. Tom shot back that she stood free, and they held no right to her. The air crackled swift, Vance's crew fanned wide, grips on their irons, and Tom felt the scales tip hard against him. But ere the initial barrel could lift true, a keen trill rang over the fields. From the bluff rearward of the spread, a row of Apache fighters materialized, hushed, grim, eyeing with icy aim. Their arrival halted Vance's lot cold. Lyra advanced and lifted her arm. A rider signaled sharp in reply, the others trailing him down the rise. They ringed the spread in a watchful ring, not lunging, but poised plain for strife. Tom saw it then. Lyra had contrived to signal or mark trails her kin alone would heed. She hadn't stood solitary. She had merely bided time for the fitting hour to summon them. Vance faltered, barking retreat to his band, but the hour had passed. The Apache headman alighted and neared Lyra, conversing in their shared voice. She laid out the tale, how Tom had spurned yielding her, how he'd shielded her, how he'd hazarded all to afford her haven when duty bound him to none. The headman hearkened, then pivoted to Tom and weighed him with a piercing look. At length he inclined his head, once, a sign richer than speech. Relief washed over Tom, but he felt the heft of what he'd claimed. Not mere faith, but their ward. Vance made a final frantic lunge to cow the throng, but the Apaches closed ranks in wordless accord, driving him and his to bolt sans a lone report. When the grit cleared, Lyra met Tom's eyes with a tenderness he'd yet to glimpse. She came to him, pressing her hand solid to his breast, atop his pulse, a token of esteem and thanks in her ways. Tom felt the earth tilt in that breath, not from dread or peril, but from grasping the weight of her touch. She wasn't merely secure now, she'd claimed her place. The Apache headman addressed Lyra anew, tendering escort home straight away. But she glanced rear to the spread, to the soul who'd risen for her sans prospect of gain. She told them she desired to linger a spell, not from debt, but from will. The fighters honored her call, bestowing a slim, etched token for Tom as emblem of regard. As they spurred away, Lyra and Tom lingered side by side on the veranda, in a hush that asked no filling. Tom had stepped to that poker table chasing a wonder to salvage his spread. In its stead, he'd found something wholly unforeseen, a tie that reshaped his days beyond his wildest reckoning. The prize he'd been duped into taking had turned the very force who mended his resolve, bolstered his hearth, and altered his land's course for all time. And somewhere profound within, he knew his days had sparked fresh, alongside her.